My next guest is Dr. Marcy Roan. She is a veteran educator who has spent most of her career as a coach of teachers and school leaders. Her experiences at the classroom, school district, and state levels provide a unique perspective for educators looking to transform schools and drive student achievement. Dr. Roan is an accomplished school leader with proven results at the elementary and middle school levels in both Title I and non-Title I schools. She's the author of Learning Rounds with Teachers. Welcome to the podcast, Marcy.
So much for having me, Dana.
Well, it's great having you on. I heard your recording with Principal Caffelli several months back and decided to have a chat with you as well, based on your school leadership experience. I'll start off with a question I ask everybody. Tell me about a time when you were in the trenches and managed to crawl out.
Gosh. I think the most powerful example I have of being in the trenches is doing the work around learning rounds. The learning rounds process for me and myself as a school leader. I have been in some of the most challenging schools and trying to drive improvement while putting out fires and just doing the daily work of schools. It takes really intentional, targeted focus to be able to make sure that amidst all of the things that can happen in a school, that learning is front and center. And I would have to say that's probably my biggest in the trench. And I do that work. I did it as a principal, and even now when I do that work with principals, um, we're in the trenches together, and we're learning and growing together through that process.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Tell me a little bit about some of what you do now versus what you did as a principal and how your work as a principal informs what you're doing now.
My work as a principal is foundational to what I do now. What I do now is I support principals, and I am charged with developing the principals that I work with. And I couldn't do that work if I didn't know where they are, if I hadn't walked in their shoes. I wouldn't be able to support them in a way that's meaningful and that is real in terms of their challenges and what they're facing in schools, because I've been there.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that very much informs what I do now, and has created the foundation that I use to support principals now.
Mm-hmm. 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 And when you're working as a principal in a challenging school, especially for new leaders or if they've changed roles and gone to a different district, what were some of the challenges that you faced working in the Title I school? We talked a little bit in the pre-chat about just the academics with the state testing, CTE, et cetera. But what would you say were some of the biggest challenges?
The biggest challenge in working with schools today, again, is around learning how to focus on what really matters, which is making sure that we're improving life outcomes for kids, and
Mm-hmm.
doing that through having a quality education. So I think that for new principals, the biggest challenge that I've experienced and that I've heard through the coaching of principals and beginning principals is around the management of time, and trying to weed out those things, those time suckers, and creating systems and structures so that we don't get caught up in all of the little things. It doesn't make them unimportant.
Yeah.
It just makes it harder for us to do the work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you've written a book, Learning Rounds with Teachers, which was published in 2022. So how has that informed the work that you do now working with principals, and what can people expect when they buy the book?
So I wrote Learning Rounds with Teachers when I was still a principal and working in schools. I was doing a learning rounds process in my schools. And the reason I started doing that is, well, it started from having a serious illness with a relative, and spending a lot of time in the hospital and seeing that process that doctors and physicians and nurses do with patients around the learning rounds process,
Mhm.
and how they learn from each other. And in the work of schools, we can't be the only person driving improvement in our building, especially in our highly impacted schools. So using that idea to then take teachers and instructional support staff and assistant principals, and leveraging the power and harnessing the power of learning and group learning in the rounds process to foster school improvement. So doing that work in my own building, I attribute a lot of the gains that I had as a school leader using that process,
Mhm.
and getting really good at creating the systems around how to make that happen on a regular basis. So that's kind of where the book comes from, is wanting to help school principals. Okay, I want to do this. I want to do it with my teachers. A lot of the research out there is doing it from a district standpoint,
Mhm.
or outside of a school principal, doing using actual teachers in part of this process. So I just wanted to share how I took the idea of learning rounds and used my teachers' expertise and their lens to walk through our building and really facilitate change. So the book is a really short read. It's let's see, it's only a couple hundred pages.
Mhm.
It's not a real dense read. I didn't want something that principals would have to spend their entire summer reading.
Mhm.
And it basically just gives you a framework for how to get started with learning rounds, and kind of the purpose behind it, and how to build that from the ground up if you haven't done something like that before.
Mhm. 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 And that includes really involving the whole staff in these learning rounds and providing maybe setting up some class coverage or some substitute pay, right? Because that's also what I think a lot of principals are first worried about. How are we going to get those classes covered if we're setting up the
Mm-hmm.
learning rounds? I think those can be so effective, really, for everybody to learn from their peers. A lot of teachers are just isolated in their classroom and they don't even visit people in their own department. But
That's
how
exactly right.
for those people who are a little worried about maybe the budget or like the time and how do we structure all this, where's a good place to start?
Well, like many principals, budget's always a concern, and
Mhm.
at the time that I was doing learning rounds, also finding substitutes was a challenge.
Yeah.
So we started the work doing it through our planning periods.
Uh-huh.
So I would use teachers during their collaborative planning time. That's when we would facilitate the rounds. Now that's good, because then you don't need the coverage for the teachers who are conducting the rounds. The challenge that I found in that is that you're really limited to, you don't really get to see the breadth of the building,
Yeah.
because the only thing you have available is what's going on during that particular planning time.
Hmm.
So there's some trade-offs. I have done coverage with subs and all of that, but I think if you're just starting out and you don't have the funds and you just kind of want to start small,
Hmm.
using that planning time as a means of continual learning. And that's not to hijack a teacher's planning time, and because there's importance in that as well. But this can help teachers plan better when they're walking around the building. They're seeing what other teachers are doing, and they're taking ideas, and they can integrate that into their own planning.
Hmm. Hmm. And did you have a type of rubric or observation form that you made within your school for people to take notes, or was it more observe and then debrief with the group afterwards?
Yes, to both questions. There's actually in the book, there's actually a link to get some just some sample documents.
Okay.
I started out really, really simple. first of all, I had to build a culture of this happening in my building, because we couldn't just roll up 3 or 4 people deep into a classroom and expect everything to go well. We had to build that culture that this was going to happen. But so we walked in without anything. We just walked in and talked about what we noticed. When we got to the point where we started actually noting what was happening, it was really simple. It was just, what is the teacher doing and what are the students doing? Because what I wanted to do in building that reflective practice is to get teachers to be able to identify what is the impact of the instructional decisions that are being made at the point in time that we're in the classroom. Because when we can start to connect what's happening with the learning to the choices the teacher's making instructionally, there's real power in that.
And after you got started, how many years were you in that building? And when you left the building, was it in a place where they kind of had that fine-tuned machine?
It was 3 years in the making. I was shifted to another school at the end of 3 years, to a middle school, actually, from an elementary setting. And yes, it was at a place where it could be sustainable. Now, like any leadership with changes, it really depends on who takes the seat next and whether that gets what part of what's happening gets saved and honored. To be honest, I don't know if it is still happening in my building. I know the year or two after I left, it was still occurring in smaller ways. But once teachers find power in the process, they're willing to support it and advocate for it as well. But it also comes down to making sure that you've got the master schedule set up in a way that facilitates this kind of process. So there's a lot of other smaller decisions that if another leader is not willing to come in and they have their own vision of how things need to go, it can shift.
Say that somebody is an AP who has some experience with this type of round in a school, and they come on as an AP. How could an AP help influence or advocate for this type of model in a school that they're joining, and what would an AP's role be?
That's a great question, because APs, in my experience, I don't find that APs get a whole lot of instructional support and professional development around becoming an instructional leader. I would encourage any assistant principal to start where they are. Many assistant principals get assigned content areas or smaller groups of teachers, maybe not the whole building, but smaller groups of teachers that they supervise and support. And I would start there, small start, and use the groups that you're already assigned to start thinking about how can I build the instructional capacity of those teachers that I'm responsible for, but also my own leadership skills and my own instructional leadership repertoire, because that's probably the biggest gap. I've been on a lot of hiring teams with principals, and that's probably the biggest gap when assistant principals apply for principalships. They haven't really had the opportunity to demonstrate, if they already are instructional leaders, but really to practice that in the leadership setting. So I would encourage them to use what they have, and then use those experiences to have conversations with the school leader and say, these are the things that are happening with these teachers in the building, and here are some of the benefits we're seeing from this type of process. And that would, to encourage the leader of the building to perhaps try it on a larger scale.
And also, what are the benefits of like cross-curricular rounds? I worked in a school at one point where we were doing cross-curricular PLCs because they had a very well-oiled PLC model and early release Wednesday. So once a month it was cross-curricular PLCs, and that's a great time to plan and discuss with other subjects, but to get ideas from somebody. If you're teaching languages and you're in the art classroom, for example, how did that work in the school you were at?
That's a great opportunity, because I mean, we all know those kids that maybe they have maybe they're really successful in art class, and but they don't do well in another teacher's classroom. And it's not just about personalities, sometimes that can be a big sticking point, but for the most part, sometimes a lot of times it's about the instruction that's connecting with that kid,
Mhm.
with that student, that's happening in the other rooms. So when you're able to see students in different content areas, I think there's power in that, and be able to see them as a learner outside of whatever content area you have them in,
Mhm.
and how they respond to the teaching that's happening.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, and I think once also when it comes to for the maybe the deans and the assistant principals, if you're seeing a student who's maybe had some discipline issues in certain teachers' classes and maybe they're
Yeah.
thriving and they're getting
Mhm.
along well in other teachers' classes, it's also interesting to see maybe the interactions between the adult and the student in certain classes
Yep.
as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah, and it's so much more powerful when you can see that difference,
Hmm.
than if you're just standing around in the teachers lounge talking about a particular child, and
Yeah.
someone says, well, they behave for me in this classroom, and
Yeah.
it puts you on the defensive, right? Because it just sounds like you're doing something that someone else is or is not doing. So
Hmm.
yeah, there's great power in the cross curricular perspective, and being able to do that.
Hmm. 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 So do you have professional development that you provide, or do you speak at conferences? Do you have any coming up in early 2024 that you'd like to highlight?
Awesome. I'm not currently scheduled in conferences. I'm looking for a few. I've had a lot of things taken up my time recently. I've just sent my last child off to college, so there was just a whirlwind of activity happening there. I do offer professional development, and I encourage folks to reach out to me if they would like professional development, or would like some sort of some consulting support around getting learning rounds started in their schools or in their districts, because I've done them in both settings. But yeah, I am looking at some conferences going into 2024, but haven't set any in my sights yet. Just kind of looking for those that would be a best fit.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, it's been a great conversation about instructional rounds and your role in helping this happen at the school you were at. Out of everything we've talked about, what's one thing you'd like listeners to remember?
Um, I think the most important thing that I've learned, not just in the learning rounds process as a leader, but in any aspect where I've wanted to make a change as a leader, there is power in small improvements and slow gains.
Hmm.
It's hard to remember,
Hmm.
because school is such a fast place to be. There's always something happening and going, and it can be really easy to get caught up in the busyness and forget about the overarching goals and the changes that may need to take place. So I
Hmm.
think I would encourage all leaders to really remember that there is power in small improvements and slow gains, and we want to go slow to go fast, right? If I can start right and get a good foundation going, then I can increase speed later on once we're really good at what we're doing.
Hmm.
But I want to make it small and manageable at first, because
Hmm.
nobody needs more to do. We just need to figure out how to do what we're doing as
Hmm.
best as best we can.
Hmm. Yeah, that's so well put because I think in leadership, there are people that, are worried about the mandates from the district or the
Mhm.
state. And if something is going slow, it could be seen as not successful, right? But
Right,
like
right.
sometimes it does take that time and also staff to understand, if they want change, that the school is heading in the right direction. But like you said, it's the small improvements over time.
Yeah. Yep. Yep.
Where can people connect with you and find you online?
Well, I have a Facebook group called leadlearners.net.
Okay.
I'm on Instagram at lead.learners. And you can find me on a website. It's I made a bit.ly link because it's a Google site and it's just really long. So it's just bit.ly / lead learners Roan.
Okay.
And people can email me at Roan, ROANMARCY @gmail.com.
Great. I'll make sure all that information is in the show notes. Well, thank you so much for being my guest on the Out of the Trenches podcast today. I hope this will have learners get interested in implementing rounds at their school and pick up your book if they haven't already. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. You as well. Thank you for having me, Dana.